Well, welcome to this Crawford School public forum on the G20 at 5. Today actually is the 5th birthday to a day when the leaders' meeting took place in Washington to initiate the summit-level discussions in the G20 process, and we're delighted to host this event in cooperation with the Brookings Institution in Washington and our colleagues from around the world and around the region who've joined us to discuss issues in the lead up to our hosting the G20 Summit in Australia next November. I'm delighted to introduce the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, to introduce the Minister.
Thank you very much, Peter. First, let me begin, as we always do at ANU, by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australian on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Australian National University. My name is Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at this university. On the 1st of December this year, Australia will assume the chair of the G20 for a year. G20 members account for 85% of the world's economy, 80% of global trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. The G20 represents all geographic regions of the world, but remains small enough to be a very effective decision-making body. Today's forum, G20 at 5, will take a comprehensive look at the history and trajectory of G20 summits over the last 5 years. A very impressive list of speakers you're about to hear from come from diverse areas ranging from the Asia Development Bank through to the Brookings Institute. And I welcome Brookings and thank them for joining us. I also express my gratitude personally to the Asian Development Bank, who most recently have provided us with advice, and the government on the workings of qualifications frameworks in Asia. Their work is far and profound, so thank you for joining us. The discussions today are sure to play an important part in helping to shape input into Australia's hosting of the G20 Summit next year. And I want to express my special thanks also to Peter Drysdale, who's co-chairing today's forum, for his efforts in bringing together the day, and to the Brookings Institution, who are co-hosting today's event. You'll have an opportunity to hear from Professor Drysdale later today. His session will focus on the expected developments in the Chinese economy over the next decade and what this might mean for the G20. This session ties in closely with the remarks former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, often referred to as the father of the G20, made urging the Australian government to use the G20 to help establish Asia as the world's next leading economic superpower. But now we come to the here and now, and delivering the open remarks today this morning is Senator the Honourable Brett Mason, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Born in Canberra, so he's a local boy, Brett Mason was first elected to the Senate for Queensland, which is a bit up north, in 1998. I'm very proud to say that he holds a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws with honours from ANU, a Masters in Philosophy from Cambridge University, and a PhD from Griffith University. I just asked the Senator what he majored in his arts degree, and he said political science and philosophy. And we both mutually agreed, and I have no conflict of interest, being a philosopher, saying what a very splendid training and education that was. And we both, I think, mutually expressed the view that more philosophers in government and making decisions would be a very, very helpful thing. But I also think we probably agree, Senator, that perhaps people with economics training and ability to use data and numbers is also useful too. Possibly. We're very proud of not only his academic achievements, but his ongoing contribution to the nation. It's a contribution that I think is characterised by the fact that he's trained in philosophy as one of profound thoughtfulness. And we're very proud to have him back on the campus. We always like to welcome him back. He was, before he became a senator, he was a lecturer in criminology, which is a little way from philosophy, but he was a lecturer in criminology, and he also served as a Commonwealth prosecutor. So he's been on the blue sky side, the prosecution side, but also the conviction side. So it's all very helpful, and it means that he can take lots of different angles. We're very proud of his achievements. We're delighted that he's here today. We're proud of his contributions to the nation, but also his work for the wider world, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia particularly, where he's played an integral role in providing legal and policy advice. and helping to improve human civil rights and civil administration. It's a contribution that we as Canberrans are proud of, but one that the world ought to be proud of. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mason to the lectern.
Marnie, thank you for that very warm welcome. And look, it is wonderful to be back at the ANU, and I did love my time here, and I'm not just saying that because I'm back here, but it was without doubt one of the most enjoyable periods of my life. Although, Marnie, it's a long, long time ago now. I think I started here in 1980, but it seems like yesterday, and it was a wonderful time of my life. And all of you who study here should be pleased that you do so. And this is one of the world's truly great universities. Marnie, to you, Professor Drysdale, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Marnie, you spoke about politicians and the ANU. There have been some very noted politicians who are graduates, of course, of the ANU, some who've retired just this week. And I'm told that generally, when all graduates of the ANU are welcome back, but those who are politicians, if they're on any honour boards anywhere, their names are to be deleted. But I'm told that's just a rumour, Marnie. I'm told that's just a rumour. This morning, ladies and gentlemen, can I just focus on two issues? Two issues. First of all, how the G20 has made a difference over the past 5 years. Marnie mentioned that it's the 5th year anniversary. And secondly, how this will help to define the G20 under Australia's presidency, to be launched by the Prime Minister in only, 2 weeks' time, on the 1st of December, when Australia assumes the presidency. A 5-year anniversary provides a great vantage point to look back and see where we've come from, and how well we tried to get where we are now, accounting for 86% of the world's gross product, 80% of world trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. The G20 is clearly an international body of substance and certainly gravity. As I see it, a sort of informal Security Council of international political economy. Though in its first 5 years, the G20 has worked in a rather more collegial way than the Security Council did in its first 5 years. The G20's mission is to address the real economic problems of the day, deciding what the countries can do individually and collectively to deal, of course, with those challenges. And I think you'd all agree, what a baptism of fire it has been. Right from the word go, just as the G20 was born, at the height, or perhaps, of course, the depth of the global financial crisis, the G20 set and delivered a major program of financial reform. It did that from the word go. It headed off imminent global economic collapse in London in April 2009. It established a framework for economic growth. It buttressed the global monetary system. It prevented a large-scale breakout of protectionism. It strengthened the rules on finance and anti-corruption, and it made key institutions far more inclusive, including the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF and the Financial Stability Board. It's a paradox, ladies and gentlemen. It's a paradox, but the G20 is sometimes criticised for being less effective when it doesn't have a particular crisis to address. We have to be sensitive to this criticism because there's still a lot to do, and because credibility, let me tell you, is critical in international politics. But some of the criticism is certainly misplaced. The G20 has moved. It's moved its focus from dealing with issues that were immediate and where galvanising cooperation was essential, to issues that we now know take rather longer to sort out. Such efforts don't necessarily grab the headlines. these sorts of efforts don't necessarily grab the headlines. They're not set against the backdrop of glamorous, if they really are glamorous, multilateral summits. They're a hard slog, often done by anonymous officials, anonymous public servants over endless cups of coffee in working meetings that drag on all day and all night, not by politicians grasping for a microphone. It's all done behind the scenes. We're in a rebuilding phase in the global economy, and rebuilding will take time. But we're confident, Australia's confident, that the G20 is the right forum. It has the agility, the ability and the power to determine the tone and the direction of globalisation. Its membership, including both advanced as well as emerging economies, both the G8 and the BRIC economies, major players from all the continents and all the regions of the world, brings the right countries and the right mix of the countries together to the table. This makes the G20 the most important tool we have to steer global economic development and indeed transformation. Australia is confident that the G20 is moving the world in the right direction. The challenge in 2014 is to continue to build the momentum of the past 5 years and to turn the strategies into action. At the same time, we need to remember that this is a long-term game and we need to keep expectations realistic. It's in this context that we should view Australia's G20 presidency to be launched by the Prime Minister Tony Abbott on the 1st of December. When I reflect on it as a contemporary Australian politician, I realise how much the challenges before the G20 are similar to those faced by Australia, and how much the approach that Tony Abbott wants to see the G20 take to face these challenges is the approach that the Prime Minister is taking to face our domestic, our Australian economic challenges. It's about being realistic what can be done and what can't be done by a large multilateral group like the G20. It's about a clear focus. It's about addressing core issues that go to the heart of economic growth. It's about a frank debate. It's about clear communication, and it's about straight talk. All in all, a very no-nonsense Australian approach to running organisations and to running anything. Before I talk about the tasks that Australia sees before its presidency, let us remind ourselves of the current global environment in which all of us, every one of us here, has to work. Economic reform is essential for the prosperity of every nation. And let's face it, it's a lesson that we here in Australia learned throughout the 1980s and beyond, and we have never really looked back. In fact, I've been overseas quite a bit recently in this new role, working with Julie Bishop. And so often, ministers in foreign countries talk about Australia's reforms in the 1980s. They talk about it consistently. And let's face it, it wasn't my party that meant much of that reform. Of course, it was Labor Party under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, although the coalition supported much of that reform. But that reform, it started when I was here at the ANU, Marnie. It started when I was here at the ANU, transformed this nation and made us a much better nation. And 30 years later, we are still reaping the benefits of that reform. And you know what? All around the world, they know it too. And I think now that in the late 70s, might have been the early 80s, when Lee Kuan Yew said we would end up as the poor white trash of Asia. Remember that? Well, it didn't happen. Why is that? Because we took some very hard decisions about 30 years ago that transformed our country and made it a better place. And we're still reaping the benefits here today. It's one piece of advice we have for the rest of the world. Reforms are tough, but they're necessary. You just have to do it, grind your teeth, and bear the momentary pain for long-term gain, because there is pain. There's no doubt about it. Economic reform is particularly crucial at a time when global growth is still in low gear. The IMF has recently downgraded its global forecast For the seventh time in 2 years, they've downgraded the forecast for the world. Some improvement is starting to occur in the major economies of the United States and in Japan and even in Europe, and we welcome that, though the growth is sluggish and the growth is patchy. To borrow from Sir Winston Churchill, this is not the beginning of the end, but hopefully the end of the beginning of this very, very difficult period. So much more remains to be done. But at the same time, concerns are starting to emerge about problems in emerging economies, which until now have weathered the economic storms of the past few years. So it's actually, folks, it's a complex picture. Recovery is patchy, and emerging and developed economies are facing different challenges. In the coming year, we need to maintain stability and growth in the global economy. In short, growth is too weak, and our economies are not creating enough jobs. G20 leaders understand all that, hence their agreement in St. Petersburg that lifting economic growth and creating jobs would remain the forum's top priority right throughout 2014. Now all of us have to act on the commitment at St. Petersburg to develop and implement comprehensive growth strategies. Many countries have already extensively used fiscal and monetary policy to deal with their problems. They've done that. The Treasuries have done that. Now is the time to commit to practical and concrete reforms that will empower the private sector to drive new growth and employment. Governments are neither the engines of growth nor of job creation, but they can help. But we all know how much they can hinder, whether it's in Australia or elsewhere. The private sector provides the vast majority of jobs worldwide, and it'll be the private sector which will help to lift the G20 and the rest of the world economies out of their slumber. That's why we'll have to have such a heavy focus on finding ways to generate increased medium to long-term investment. And given the strong links between trade and growth, trade reforms will be also very important. Domestically, I know my friend Andrew Robb, the Trade Minister, is doing much, of course, on bilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements with other nations, but globally and multilaterally, trade reform continues to be vital. Another key priority will be to work with others to improve the global economy's resilience so that we're better placed to handle future shocks and avert crises. Also, the G20 members need to implement existing commitments to strengthen the international financial sector and modernise our tax systems. The discussion continues to be around further reform of global institutions such as the IMF and the Financial Stability Board to ensure they better reflect the realities of the 21st century. Australia sees it as one of the more important tasks of its presidency to make the G20 work better and also to communicate far better. We're talking about effective actions that make a real difference. We're also talking about effective communication between the G20 leaders. Sure, that's important, but also, of course, as well as the G20 and the rest of the world. This includes dialogue with other regional forums such as ASEAN, APEC and the East Asia Summit, as well as with developing countries, including through the Commonwealth and La Francophonie. We need to ensure the world knows what the G20 is doing, why it is doing it, and why it matters so very much to everyone, especially because of the challenges that the G20 is trying to address are the same ones that face the rest of the world. And the solution that the G20 puts in place are meant to help not just the G20, but the G193, everyone. Business, civil society, academia, youth, think tanks, all have strong contributions to make to the debate. Your ideas and perspectives will be important to Australia's success in the presidency and the G20's success in putting the global economy back on a high growth, high employment road. That's why I'm delighted to be here this morning at the start of this important forum. Can I say the government looks forward to continuing this conversation with you throughout 2014. And Marnie and Professor Drysdale, can I thank you, the Crawford Centre, and everyone for having back an old graduate from many years ago to address you this morning. It's been an absolute delight, and all the very, very best in your deliberations. Thank you.
Let me formally thank Senator Mason most warmly for the substantial remarks he made at the beginning of our discussion today. It's a great pleasure to have you back here, Senator Mason, and to have you in this role is a reassurance, and your comments certainly will be a good perspective to place on the conversations that we have in our panels this morning. Thank you very much indeed. We'll move now to the first panel discussion of our meeting. If the panellists in the first session would like to move forward, I'll introduce the chairman of this first panel. It's my particular pleasure to warmly welcome Dr. Kamal Dervish from the Brookings Institution. Kamal is the Vice President International of Brookings and has played a leading role in the development of thinking about the work of the G20 ever since its establishment in summit form. Kamal will lead a distinguished panel from Australia and elsewhere in the discussion of the core issues of the G20 in this first panel. He's joined by Mike Callaghan from the Lowy Institute and formerly from the Treasury here in Australia, Dr. Colin Bradford, who's also from the Brookings Institution in Washington, Dr. Homi Kharas from the Brookings Institution, and David Vines from Oxford University on his routine sojourn here at the ANU in our school. So please welcome the first panel.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Australian National University and to the Australian government for their hospitality. Brookings has had quite a history in G20 work. Way before the Leaders G20 was actually formed was forced by the crisis. My colleagues at Brookings, I wasn't there at the time, but had already proposed that such a meeting does take place and that leaders take personal responsibility. There was, of course, the G20 Finance Ministers Group, but it was not meeting at leaders group. And Colin is one of those who initiated that, so he has a special loyalty to the whole G20 process. I do believe that the G20 has helped a lot in overcoming what could have been even worse of an economic crisis than the world already experienced. It's not easy to say what would have happened, what wouldn't have happened, but the G20 took the initiative, took a leading role, sent the right messages, particularly during the London Summit, which was chaired at that time by Gordon Brown, and stopped the slide into disaster, really, in the world economy. I think many of us remember the days of 2008 September where there was real panic. I was in New York at the time heading the United Nations Development Program, and I can tell you the city was in panic. It was the capital, of course, of the financial world. Since then, things have improved, stabilized somewhat, but there's still a deep malaise, as the minister mentioned. Growth, the recovery is being kind of encouraged and backed by extremely expansionary monetary policy, by interest rates that are in the negative territory in real terms, zero in nominal terms. And this has gone on now for years. So it is way too early to say that a real natural recovery is on the way in the world, that the Western and Japanese economy, the advanced economies in particularly, are really growing in a more normal way without the extraordinary support of these central banks. And I think there still is a danger that the recovery will falter and that we face new global economic problems. The second point I'd like to make is that the G20, of course, was a dramatic change from the G7 format, which represented the world of the 20th century, if you like, to the world of the 21st century, incorporating the major emerging market economies, including Australia, of course, including Turkey, my own country. And in that sense, it was a real shift, a watershed in terms of global governance. That doesn't mean that the G20, even if it was a G30, has the legitimacy to claim that it represents the whole world. It represents the G20. The minister mentioned the very high percentages of population and GDP that represents. But as somebody who deeply believes in democratic values and values of human equality for all, I would like to say that those of us who support the G20, at least speaking for myself, we support it with a view that it takes a leading role, that it facilitates initiatives and implementation that benefits the whole world community. It cannot be that a self-appointed group becomes a kind of world government. That's not the point. But it does support good governance and reform in the world economy. I think we'll talk more about that. So what are some of the core issues? Well, the G20 is, of course, a forum where leaders can exchange views, and that in itself is extremely important. They get to know each other better. There's a confidence building, and that in itself has huge value. But there are very strong interdependencies in the world economy. We saw that the failure of one bank in Wall Street and then AIG precipitated the biggest economic crisis since the 1930s in the whole world, including in China. In the second half of 2008, the Chinese economy was contracting. I mean, it was not just the advanced economies that faced the problem, but it was a worldwide problem. It was triggered by a financial crisis in the North Atlantic region, if you like, but it had global. And today, if a major international financial institution were to fail, wherever it may be, we would face the same problem. So financial interdependence in financial markets is a hugely important aspect of global interdependence. The second is the real economy, trade flows. US demand is helping the whole world economy. Australian demand, not to the same degree, of course, is helping the whole world economy. But at the same time, these demands are interdependent. Your exports are imports somewhere else, and vice versa. So to have a functioning trade system is a major global public good, and to have a macroeconomy which functions in such a way that particular countries don't trigger either strong deflationary or inflationary processes in the world economy is also very important. We remember the days when China had a surplus of close to 10% of GDP. It was considered to be a major problem. Why? Because 10% of GDP meant 10% of Chinese GDP worth of excess global savings, which had to be compensated by investment somewhere else. And if that wasn't happening, this is a global imbalance that can create a major problem. The Chinese current account surplus has declined a lot. I don't want to go into details. There are other current account surpluses that have increased, particularly in Northern Europe. So the whole issue of global imbalances and coordination of fiscal and monetary policy is a major issue for the G20, and I think will remain on the agenda. The third point I'd like to make, in that context, and I think we face one very interesting and strange problem in the world economy, but it is also an opportunity. There is a great need for renewed infrastructure everywhere, including in Europe, including in the United States, but of course also in the emerging markets that need more energy, more infrastructure to support their growth. India is often the case. One mentions that if Indian infrastructure was strengthened, it could probably add 2-3 percentage points to Indian growth rates. So there's demand, there's need for infrastructure. At the same time, because of the monetary policies and the overall economic situation in the world, interest rates are extremely low. So there are many of us, not all, there are some who may not fully agree with this, but I'm throwing it out, and I will ask my Callaghan to lead off on that actually. There seems to be a strong case for investing in infrastructure using the savings that are available at costs that are at historical lows. And by creating assets, not consuming things, but creating assets that will support future economic performance and growth, this would seem to be a win-win type of situation. And yet it's not quite happening. And I know that Australia, and also in St. Petersburg, this was already a priority, but Australia, I think, is choosing this as one priority topic to focus on for the G20. The next point I'd like to make is development poverty. You know, there has been growth in the world economy. Clearly, hundreds of millions of people have moved out of poverty. There's a growing global middle class, and these are extremely positive phenomena. But there still are very, very poor people in the world economy, pretty much everywhere, but particularly in Africa and also in Latin America and parts of Asia. India, for all its growth, is still in need of fighting poverty in a very major way. So the development agenda, the fighting poverty agenda, remains extremely important, I think. And all G20 meetings have recognized that. How much they have implemented then later on, how much the international community has really implemented that agenda, I think remains to be debated. But it is part of the G20 efforts, and I think both political and ethical issues require that the fighting poverty agenda remains center stage. Homi Kharas has just, my colleague Homi Kharas has just finished work on the post-2015 agenda and what comes after the MDGs, and I'm sure he will want to share his views on how this interacts with the G20. I don't want to take more time, but there was one thing that I also want to touch on, which I think is important. In the entire world, people with limited incomes are being asked to make serious sacrifices. I think the biggest example of that is in Europe. Europe is, of course, a wealthy continent, but believe me, today in Greece and Spain, there are very poor people. And in Greece, the situation is so bad that the whole health system has collapsed. There is a challenge of defining a budget, a fiscal strategy, a retirement system, a health system. In the US, that's the case, very much so. The debate, as you know, is very much about the health system, that is fiscally sustainable, but at the same time, that provides the social help and solidarity that those who are the most vulnerable need. So there is need, and debts have increased in so many parts of the world, not in the emerging markets. I think Australia is in a particularly strong position on the debt side, but public debt has become a heavy burden on fiscal actions by the government, on social solidarity, and getting the fiscal policies right is very important. These are not necessarily all interdependent, but there is some interdependence in these fiscal issues. And one thing that is on the agenda of the G20, I think very rightly, and you know, it is not somebody left of the political center, but rather somebody right of the political center, Prime Minister David Cameron, that took an strong role in that. So I want to kind of recognize that. Given the sacrifices that the vulnerable people and the poor people are being asked to endure and to take, and some of them, unfortunately, are very tough, it is really not acceptable that multinational corporations whose profits are at all-time highs use legal systems of tax avoidance by shifting their profits, you know, in artificial ways to the lowest tax jurisdiction, and some of them paying very, very little taxes in a world where we have these fiscal problems. So since I personally think this is a very important issue, but the Australian presidency has already accepted that as to be one of the major issues, and I wanted to flag that. I think if we want to succeed in rebalancing the world economy, if we want to have the support, long-term support of the world's citizens, I think the leadership of the G20 has to take these social issues seriously and the burden sharing and the sharing of opportunities have to be thought of in an equitable and inclusive way. So with those few words of introduction, I'd like to turn first to Mike. You've played a leading role for Australia and on the global scene, but particularly I think you are very interested also in this infrastructure issue, that or any other topic you want to pick up, but particularly on infrastructure, what can be done?
Great. Okay, well, thanks, Camille. And it was a terrific introduction, and I thought the Minister gave a very good introduction too. And I'll start with this on the question of infrastructure, because I do think it can outline one of the real problems and challenges of everything of dealing with the G20. What's the world need? It needs growth. It needs jobs. It needs more demand out there. Every country needs to improve its infrastructure. Australia certainly does, the developing countries do, the United States does, and this can be a very forceful period of growth, a force for growth of infrastructure. But it's not a magic bullet, and I think that's the point that came out that the Senator said, that you've got to be realistic, you've got to look at the whole, everything that's required to get growth going. You can't look, there's no magic bullet to say, right, we can do this through this growth of demand, infrastructure. You've got to look at what all the components are that's required to get this growth going. If we look at infrastructure, countries have to improve their investment environments. A lot of that is structural reform, a lot of that is ensuring their legal systems are right. We have to get the financing right. There's plenty of financing out there if there's bankable projects. Part of that is ensuring that the markets are working, the intermediation is working, capital markets are working. For developing countries, they have to improve their capital markets to make sure that they work. We have to make sure that the multilateral institutions are working in terms of helping developing countries. That's going to be an important part of it. So the whole question of all these things, it's an integrated, comprehensive story. And I think that's the challenge we have in delivering what the Minister set out as those objectives of getting growth going, restoring. We have a very vulnerable global environment. I think, as you say, there's a good chance we could have another crisis. There's lots of vulnerabilities out there. We're in a huge macroeconomic experiment in terms of where operation of monetary policy, how this is all going to unravel. There's a lot of things out there that we have to work together, but there's no magic bullets as such. And I think getting growth going, it's having to look at all the components of it, having a comprehensive story, that they're all integrated into it. The structural reforms that we talk about are critical aspects of getting infrastructure going. The reforms of the financial sector, of getting markets, capital markets going, are critical parts of getting the infrastructure going. The reforms of making sure the multilateral organisations, the multilateral development banks are doing their jobs are critical parts of getting infrastructure going. So is trade. I think a good point that Andrew Elwick keeps making on this, that we look at trade, a lot of it is about interconnectivity, a lot of it is getting the infrastructure in place that allows countries to move up the global value chains that are operating. It's all part of the story. Now it's not an easy story to tell, but this is the challenge that G20 leaders have to. They have to be able to communicate, I think exactly as the Minister said, communicate to the public about how are they working together. At the moment, they're not on the same page. They're not singing from the same hymn sheet and having a coordinated approach to trying to get this growth going. They need some benchmarks that they can get behind. They need some deliverables that they can show that they are working together. They need some objectives. And I think infrastructure can be seen as one of those objectives that they say we recognise that this is an area that our countries need. We need to focus on it, and we need to see what the problem is in terms of getting it going. But, again, very important, I think, what the Minister said, this is a political movement, and one of the most important things in a political movement, or a political forum as such, it's leaders being able to take messages. There's two things you've got to do. You've got to be very careful in managing expectations. You can get into trouble if you go for too much rhetoric, so it's got to watch the rhetoric, manage the expectations, but you have to have a very clear narrative. You have to be able to communicate to the people what you're doing, how it's going to translate in creating growth, creating jobs, and that's where I think infrastructure can be an important part of it, but it's not a silver bullet. It's a comprehensive, integrated story, which is the whole growth agenda.
Thank you very much. Let me just follow on one point. I mean, I fully agree. Growth has many dimensions, and you said it very well, Mike. But there is something, if an infrastructure project is a decent one, has a return, an economic return, even if it's a public sector project, of 5%, 6%, 7%, okay? And countries which do have some fiscal space, I'm not talking of the real crisis countries. In Spain and Greece these days it's different. But in the US, in Australia, in China, in even in my own country, in Turkey, you can borrow at rates which are quite low. And so basic economics would say, let's take the US. If the US government can borrow, let's say at 1% real interest rate, and invest at 6% return, why isn't it doing it more?
A lot of the problem can be it's the political will and the domestic political problems. In the US, they have a huge infrastructure problem, but they've got a dysfunctional political system. I agree totally with you, and I think you could use Australia as a case study of this. I'm in the camp that we should be able to be borrowing at cheap interest rates to be able to invest in profitable, worthwhile infrastructure with high rates of return. To do that, it's getting the environment right, identifying those projects. Some of the things we have to do, preconditions, we have to get our pricing structures for infrastructure right. There's a lot of regulatory environments that have to be done right. Even in Australia, we've now got having an inquiry to try and work out getting the framework right to be able to do this. So you're absolutely right. The other problem, one aspect of it all, I think, is on the public side, yes, you should be able to separate between your capital investment and your recurrent expenditure. And I think even that should be on the agenda of the G20 to try and recognise that you can look at your budgets different. Everyone says, well, that we have no fiscal space, we have to look at private sector investment. A lot of infrastructure is a public good. It just doesn't meet the needs of for private sector. It doesn't have the same ability to have certainty over the returns you're going to have. Some of them, and they are public goods that should be on the public balance sheet. And we should be, I think, smarter in the way that we look and record and measure our balance sheets to be able to recognise this difference between credible capital expenditures and the recurrent expenditure. And I think that's an area that, yes, there can be, there's no silver bullet on this. We have to be able, part of it is dealing with credit rating agencies, with the investment community looking at this. We have to change the environment. But I agree totally with you. But again, there's a lot of steps to try and make this happen.
Colin, do you want to come in very quickly on this point?
Yes, because I wanted to answer your question. You gave an eloquent description of what I call the world of hurt, which is the social dimension of the crisis. And so there's a clash, the way I see it, between the reaction to globalization by the people on the street who've been affected by it, and by parliamentary politics, especially in the United States, which limit the answer to your question. In other words, even though the arithmetic of using debt to drive investment because interest rates are zero, there's a debt ceiling. We have a horrible provision in the procedures of the U.S. Congress in the United States, which is that the Congress has the authority and requirement to lift the debt ceiling. This is meant to constrain government deficits. But the fact of the matter is that Congress has already authorized the expenditures, the revenue stream is already predetermined, and so the money is already committed. So it's a completely fake thing to have to raise, it's not a control mechanism, it's a necessary adjustment of the ceiling because of decisions already made by the Congress itself. So even though the arithmetic of this idea of having infrastructure being financed by debt because of low interest rates, in the United States it would be impossible because it raised the debt and the debt ceiling, and you can't get it through the Congress.
Because of dysfunctional politics.
Exactly.
Well, we'll come back to that on the purely political side. But David, I mean, in the 1930s, one of the reactions of countries when the big depression hit was to try to divert demand to their domestic markets by protectionism. But you can divert demand to your own markets also by other devices, for example, by trying to devalue your exchange rate in various ways. And that's the whole debate on global imbalances. One country's surplus at the end of the day has to be one country's deficit. Believe it or not, I was once in an important meeting. I won't mention which country it was, but there was a question to a very successful country. It was not Germany, by the way, just so to make sure. And the question to the minister it was in Davos, what is the secret of your success? What should we all do? And his answer was, well, you should have a budget surplus and a balance of current account surplus. And of course, every country can have a budget surplus. But as long as we don't trade with outer space, every country cannot have a current account surplus. I very politely pointed out that my relationship with that minister went downhill from then on. But, but David, the interdependence of macro policies, of monetary and fiscal policies, and how that impacts recovery, how that impacts this issue of global imbalances and beggar thy neighbor policies, where you try to kind of divert demand to yourself, and if you do it all by yourself, you may be successful, but others will respond and try to divert demand to themselves. This is one of the big issues, for the whole macroeconomic framework for the G20, and yet it doesn't seem that much progress was made on trying to coordinate global macro and monetary policies. I know you've worked and you thought a lot about this. Could you share your views on that?
In the 1930s, countries were all constrained by the gold standard, and the view that led to 1931 and the collapse of that period to 31-2-3 was we need to practice that form of austerity, living on the gold standard, and each looked after their own interests in a way which led to crisis in Europe with dreadful consequences. Immediately after the Second World War and just before, in 1944, Bretton Woods, there was a great sense of excitement as people understood policies of the kind that they could adopt that made things different from this. They saw that with coordinated policies between their countries, they could usher in a world of growth and extraordinary optimism as an alternative to the deflation of the 1930s. And if we fast forward to 2008, 2009, there was this tremendous sense of challenge then in the financial crisis, very similar to what it felt like at the end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War. How will we make the world recover from this crisis that we found? And great excitement in London as people worked together with fiscal and monetary policy to bring about something very different from the collapse which many people thought might be the consequence. But since then, things have stalled. And there's now very strongly in the US, Europe, and elsewhere policies of austerity which bear an uncanny resemblance to policies of the constraint of the gold standard in the 1930s. It's important to have some idea of how big this is, that if there hadn't been fiscal austerity in Europe, best estimates are that GDP would be more than 4% higher. If there hadn't been the winding back of the expansion in the US, now GDP would be more than 2% higher. These are very big numbers holding back the recovery in the world. And what's been the consequence with that fiscal austerity, which people feel bound by? They pursue loose monetary policy and devalued exchange rates, which look very like what happened when the gold standard collapsed in the 1930s, pursuing jobs at the expense of others by monetary policy, rather than finding ways of expanding the economy domestically. And it's important, I think, to come back to what Senator Mason said at the beginning about the focus of the G20 in being about this macroeconomic difficulty that the world faced when the G20 moved from finance ministers to leaders' meetings in 2008-9, becoming a global institution with a framework for leadership in managing macro policies. And for those few months, that really worked, and the G20 really worked with the IMF to make a difference. We've got now to find the focus of helping bring policies globally towards a more growth-friendly setting. And the IMF, because of its governance difficulties and lack of leadership and an inherited lack of trust from way back for the Asia crisis, when the fund lost much of its reputation in Asia, has not been the place that this leadership can be found. The G20 was in 2009 and could still be and can still be an institution working with the IMF to bring about macroeconomic policies devoted to growth. And this involves really two things. The first is being clear just what these policies of austerity mean and how the growth of the world in the new normal which we're going through is not rapid growth and looks like stretching on for many reasons in Europe, US and elsewhere, and not being replaced by rapid enough growth in emerging markets, so that we face 5-10 years of very slow growth, seeing what the difficulties are, and then showing what a difference could be made by policies that push towards growth. And the policies that have been much discussed in meetings about the G20 now are the infrastructure policies that others have talked about. And this will involve not just private sector, but private sector in partnership with the public sector, together in enabling demand to grow within domestic economies. And the second stage is the G20 working with the IMF to lead countries towards an adoption of policies of these kinds. This is where the G20 can be really important in helping focus this leadership in a move towards policies of this kind. And when this happens, there will be less need to rely on looser monetary policies, on quantitative easing. There will be less pressure for exchange rates to depreciate. There will be a working together towards a growth profile in the world. And the G20 has a capacity to be central in pushing us in that direction.
In that connection, let me just maybe share two points. In one of the papers written for the conference we had at ANU yesterday, one of the colleagues, focused very much on fiscal space, or the capacity different countries have to use fiscal policy. It's true that, when your debt to GDP ratio is 120%, let's say like in Italy, and when your interest rates are quite high, you don't have much fiscal space. And those countries are, unfortunately, the dose and the extent can be debated, but they cannot launch an expansionary effort, and they may not even be able to borrow much, even for infrastructure, because they're not facing the zero interest rates of other countries. But there are other countries, even though their debt, also their public debt may not be very high, who really have fiscal space, who are, as we said, able to access international capital markets at very, very low interest rates, whose corporate sectors have a lot of profits looking for an outlet. And if those can kick in while the others adjust, and while there is when there's a kind of global pact that those in difficulty accelerate their structural reforms, and yes, have to unfortunately accept some sacrifices, but the others who have the space push ahead and make it easier for the former, I think that kind of framework would help a lot in the G20. There's one other point I want to just, you may find it interesting to look at some of the recent reports of the IMF on Europe. We all focus on public debt, but it's very interesting that the latest IMF report also focuses on private debt. And what they mean there is when the private sector is too leveraged, when there are too many debts, from one parts of the private sector to another or to abroad, from the household sector to the financial sector and so on. When debts have reached too high levels, there's also a great need to deleverage in the private sector. And when you try to do both at the same time, reduce public debt while the private sector is in a difficult process of deleveraging itself, of course, you create strong recessionary forces. So this whole approach also to the private sector debt and how to deal with the banks, we don't have time to deal with it. But all I wanted to say is it's not just an issue of public sector debt. There are also issues in over-leveraged private sectors. Let me give an example of my own country, and I have some of my countrymen here. Public sector debt in Turkey went down from 90% to 35%. Fantastic success. And I think Turkey is in a fairly good position. But private sector debt went up from 25 to 30%, very, very low, to close to 80%. Still not too high. But you see, now all of a sudden, I think Turkey has to watch not just its public sector debt, which is low and that's great, but also the rising private sector debt. And this is something one has to deal with. You want to come in on that?
Just a bit. Coming back to being realistic, I suppose, you talk about getting this global compact. David sets out, it's very nice if we could get all lined up to do that amongst countries. But one thing the IMF has, throughout it all, has been very consistent in the advice they've given. They've always said it should be graduated, any fiscal consolidation. If you have the fiscal space, you should be using it. You should do it in as growth-friendly means as possible. But we haven't got that compact. We've had that difference. You look at the position that Germany has taken, you look at around, we are still not on the same page. So to get to that point, we still have this, we don't have a common growth strategy. And that's one of the first challenges that we've got to try to do to try and lift it up, to confront this. And hopefully what came out of St. Petersburg was where they said, I want ministers to come forward, leaders said, finance ministers have come forward with their comprehensive growth strategies, could well be a mechanism to actually confront some of these more fundamental issues that need to be confronted to try and go forward, to try and get back on the same page.
Absolutely. Homi, I'll turn to you now. You've been leading with others, but you were the director of the whole process, the post-MDG perspective agenda for the UN Secretary General and for the world community, for the panel that dealt with that. You've been consistently an advocate and for linking the development agenda to the G20. The G20 represents large emerging market countries, rich, advanced, some of them in trouble, but nonetheless wealthy, advanced countries. Then there's South Africa, you know, one African country only, an important one, but there's the whole continent which still has huge problems. There are still 1 billion people in the world in extreme poverty. So how do you link, to what extent should one link, or should Australia also try to link what we call the anti-poverty or development agenda to the G20 agenda?
Thanks, Kamal. So I think that the development agenda is really central to the G20 agenda for a number of different reasons. You mentioned in your introduction that the G20, to have legitimacy, has to be seen not just as an informal group that's doing something for themselves, but as an informal group that's actually creating a world which benefits everyone. And I think that that is very much part of the development agenda. We have a world today in which many low-income countries in particular are not integrated with the global economy. They have not been able to really take advantage of the benefits of globalization, and the G20 needs to be sure that whatever activities they take doesn't reinforce that inequality, that actually creates more opportunity for those countries. So I think that there's a very natural sense in which the G20 needs to take responsibility for creating a broad global environment within which development can take place. Now, that doesn't mean that the G20 is responsible for development. At the end of the day, each country is responsible for their own development. But it does mean, I think, that the G20 is responsible for making sure that it doesn't crowd out inadvertently the opportunities for other countries. And what we found, I think, is that there's now a sense that development should not be thought of as being a divisive issue, something which is about what developing countries do rather than what developed countries do. I actually think that in the new world, development is about every country. I worked on a high-level panel report to the United Nations on the post-2015 agenda. And one of the observations in that report is that no country, developed or developing, no country in the world actually has managed to successfully implement a sustainable development agenda, a sustainable growth agenda. We've been talking about sustainable growth for a very long time, but no one's been actually able to do it. And it goes back a little bit to your adding up problem. It's like saying, you know, it's not just in current account surpluses where there's a global constraint. It's in all kinds of other avenues. It's with natural resources. It's with thinking about food security. It's with thinking about energy and climate change. So if one doesn't actually have a growth strategy that understands and deals with the interlinkages in many, many different areas, you're not going to be able to really have a development strategy. So I would say that now the development strategy really is twofold. There's one really important part of the development strategy which is about, you know, I think what you could say is just getting your own house in order. Every country needs to be able to grow in a way that doesn't impoverish other countries. And whether that's impoverishing them through macro means of, you know, exchange rate depreciations, or sometimes, you know, monetary, unconventional monetary policies, or whether that's impoverishing them by excessive climate emissions or, you know, wasteful consumption on food, or whether it is through having barriers to really important aspects of trade. We heard during the conference about important barriers to trade in natural gas that are leading to big differences in energy markets across the world, a real fragmentation of markets. All of those kinds of things have become real barriers to an integrated, connected world that can grow efficiently and effectively. And then there's a separate part, which is the whole international environment, the openness of the multilateral trading system, thinking about the, you know, how do we regulate global finance. We've talked about infrastructure, and we've talked about the important role that multilateral development institutions can play in financing of infrastructure. Well, the reality is that in last year, in 2012, the entire multilateral, non-concessional financial flows to developing countries was negative, minus $700 million US. Countries are repaying the multilaterals more than the multilaterals are lending out. Well, you can't build infrastructure globally in the countries that need it most, which is by and large emerging economies and low-income countries, if the institutions you've set up to do that are actually transferring money the other way. This is the reverse flows of capital. So there are big things, it seems to me, in the global system and in each individual G20 country, which need to be done, which can be done, to try to generate much more efficient growth. I would say this has to be an agenda about growth efficiency and about long-term growth efficiencies. And what's happened is that we've focused a lot on growth which is very short-term, without pricing in properly the longer-term consequences. That's something that the G20 can really take strategic decisions on, in trying to think what are the big areas where we can try to make sure that the growth and the recovery that happens is actually sustainable over the long term. I worry a bit that the G20 focus has been too much on a very short-term recovery from the crisis. And if that short-term recovery from the crisis is the same kind of growth as the growth that generated the crisis, and that's what some people worry about with unconventional monetary policy and leading to more bubbles, then we're back in the same boat. This isn't sustainable growth. So let's try to be sure that we build sustainable growth. And if we do that, that will be a dramatic contribution to reducing poverty in the world. Because at the end of the day, the strongest driver of poverty reduction is going to be individual country growth, not just because people will get jobs and be able to lift themselves out of poverty, but then those countries will have the resources that they need through taxes to be able to implement anti-poverty programs that are going to be vital, because we all know that growth by itself is not enough. There are a lot of things that governments actually need to do on the side of education, on the side of health, on the side of other things, to give people opportunities to lift themselves out of poverty. They need money in order to do that. That money is going to come from growth in developing countries.
Thank you, Homi. Now let me turn a little bit to the, I know the second panel will focus particularly on the governance aspect, but with Colin Bradford here on this panel, I don't want to miss the opportunity. He is really one of the, how shall I put it, father sounds too old, brothers or old brothers of the G20. You know, as I said, it was a major breakthrough. You probably recall how the G7 started. I mean, the French president decided at some point he wanted to have an informal talk with, you know, 4 others, the US, Germany, UK, Japan. Then it got expanded to Italy and Canada. But it was at that time a very important part of the world economy. It still is. But the emerging markets, the growth in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and particularly in Asia, of course, really changed the whole structure of the world economy, and therefore recognizing that became very urgent. And it happened with the crisis. But still, the beginning of the G20 was still kind of driven by the G7. I mean, the first meeting was called, President Sarkozy of France was in fact the first to call for a new Bretton Woods. But then President Bush quickly acted and invited the G20 at the leaders level in Washington to the November 15, 2008 meeting. And then the next meeting took place in London and then in Pittsburgh, and you know, Gordon Brown played a very important role in the London meeting. And now finally the G20 is really kind of, the leadership of the G20 is becoming truly more global. Korea was of course the first, the Republic of Korea was the first emerging market to host the G20. I want to ask Colin how he sees that evolution. I do believe myself that Australia is a very interesting country and is in a very interesting position here. As you all know, I don't have to share this with you, but you know, just to make the point, it is a country that has so many dimensions. It's Asian. On the other hand, it's kind of closely tied to the West. It has very good relations with the US, with the UK, with others. It is an emerging market economy without, you know, and at the same time, a very globally oriented society, despite the 15 hours of plane one has to ride to get here. And so it can play a very impartial role between the various constituencies. But I should also say that the old division between G7 and emerging markets is kind of breaking down, I think, Colin. You know, China and Germany have more in common vis-à-vis their current account policies and balance of payments than India and the US, which have more in common with each other, let's say. So the old dividing lines are not quite there. There are all kinds of interesting countries. I think South Africa represents Africa. You have the Latin American countries. You have Argentina. His Excellency the Ambassador is with us. The next president of the G20, the chair of the G20 will be Turkey, which is also a country a little bit like Australia with strong links to the West, but with Asia, the Middle East, and so on. But Australia now is very well placed to launch the G20 on its more steady state course of a truly global steering committee. Colin, you have contributed a lot to this whole topic. The G20 at 5 and the original idea at 10 or whatever it is, share your views as of today.
Good. Thank you. I'm older than I look, so I might qualify for a father. Thanks a lot, Kamal. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and discussing this in Australia and in a public forum like this. We've been chatting with each other yesterday, which was a very intensive and interesting discussion, but it was basically policy, what I would call wonky, right? It was a policy wonk discussion about technical details among economists. It was energizing, but maybe doesn't relate so much to public concerns. So one of the things that I think Kamal is raising here is the fact that many of us feel, Mike has said it well in your own public media often, I think, is that there are doubts now about the G20 because it seems to be slipping, because the crisis, whereas it's not resolved, at least it has attenuated somewhat. And so people who think this is an important thing, it's difficult to conceive of how you could have a global economy without any global guidance mechanism whatsoever for it. People are beginning to worry about where this goes. So Australia inherits this at a critical moment between, sort of the beginnings phases of it, where it's clearly needed to coordinate policy, as David said. So the way we've come to think about part of the problem is precisely the difference between leadership on the one hand and policy wonk business on the other. And it turns out that there are actually two parts to the G20. One is the work stream, what I call the work stream, which is the ministers of finance mostly, sometimes other ministries and government offices and officials, and the Sherpas, who really design areas of cooperation across now a broad set of issues. So I was pleased to see somebody says, well, what happens if there's a recovery? The G20 won't have any problem. Well, it turns out we're destroying the oceans. And now even the G20, if you look carefully, you can find a reference to the oceans in a little working group that's set up to do it. And it's an important thing. It's in the public interest, but nobody's going to notice it. In the end, it's wonky, right? But the fact is there's cooperation among the major powers on the oceans. So that's the work stream. So where it's been less clear that of successful conveyance to the public, at least, is the leadership track. So the summits haven't really been summits for a variety of reasons having to do with events at the same time. Is the leaders track, the leaders summits have been swamped by the wonky track. The financial issues in Europe surged in a way that you had Papandreou, the Prime Minister of Greece, in Cannes, saying he was going to hold a referendum on his restructuring program the eve of the G20 summit in Cannes, and the entire world paid attention to the Greek drama and the serious agenda in the wonk track of the G20 got lost in the process. So the question is how to fix this. And there have been a lot of discussions here with your G20 official team about that. Your team is very well aware that there's a communications issue, as Senator Mason mentioned this morning. So part of the idea is to have them have a different kind of conversation about issues that are of interest to them and that have a greater sense of public interest, and then to concentrate a lot about what they say about what they've done when they've been here. And to think about saying things, having a narrative, as Mike, I think, put it, which connects with public concerns, with anxieties of the sort that Kamal mentioned, about health systems, about social security systems, pensions, and so on, jobs, growth, incomes. Everybody's been living in a world of hurt, and the leaders have not actually succeeded in these summits so far to connect with those anxieties and concerns in the public, and nor have they been able to convey a sense of their own public responsibility for the public interest. So I think one of the things that we've been talking about with your official team here is how can the leaders in Brisbane in November next year come together and first of all have a different type of conversation among each other, and second, a different conversation between themselves as leaders and their publics and the world and the global public about why this forum matters, why it matters to have a conversation among the major countries about how to steer the global economy.
Thanks, John. I think we'll turn to you now, try to have an interactive discussion. I think I'm going to consult our super chairman, Peter Drysdale, but maybe taking 2 or 3 kind of comments at a time instead of one-to-one. and in order to kind of maximize participation. So, yes, we'll start with, please, maybe for the sake of everybody, if you just quickly identify yourself, that would be helpful.
Yeah, it's Andrew Ellick from Australian National University, and my questions are about infrastructure and where we go from here. And I think the reason why we are now talking seriously about seizing the global infrastructure opportunity is we're talking more intelligently about debt. Depends what you borrow for. It's not debt. If you borrow productively, it's a different story. And I agree with Mike, it's not just simply putting up a big eye into the macroeconomic equations and the world is fixed. Where do we start on Monday morning? I think there again, disaggregating the question is going to be quite important. A very interesting report from McKinsey Global Institute pointing to the huge gains to be made by rehabilitating and upgrading the performance of existing assets. All of the constraints you mentioned are a lot less severe. When you talk about existing assets and upgrading them, the gains are probably by far the highest. So that is an opportunity to start in a big way. Second issue is on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank launched by China. You mentioned the role of the MDBs, and I think they can do far, far more than they're doing, not just financing, but in pooling risks and helping to draw in the private sector in an intelligent way. But we have a situation where the MDBs are actually net borrowers from the rest of the world. In that situation, I'm not surprised a new infrastructure bank is being set up. But we have two kinds of reaction. I'd like to get the panel's views on it. One said, well, MDBs are doing perfectly fine, no worries, we just upgrade their performance. And who are these upstarts? The second said, well, thank goodness for Asian leadership, let's get with it. What is the view of the panel?
All right, let's take, let me just, yes, and then you in the back.
Thank you. I want to ask David a question, or anybody who has a view. At the beginning of the G20 process, the Chinese central banker Zhou Xiaochuan proposed an idea about reforming the international monetary system. It looked for a while that might be an idea the G20 would explore, or at least IMF or whatever, but obviously it went nowhere. Now the question about the QE policy exit. I think, I don't know what's the feeling in the US, but in the rest of the world, we all think this is a big deal. Even people in China, while we don't think this would cause a crisis in China, but we think that could be a force destabilizing emerging markets significant enough and could have negative implications for China. So that certainly is an issue worthwhile collaborating or deliberating or coordinating or whatever mechanism you can think of. But we spoke to the Fed, and the Fed basically said, well, it's my policy, and whatever it happens to you, it's your own problem. Is there any scope that we could really explore what might be done under the G20 framework?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, there was a gentleman all the way up. Please do identify yourself.
Yes, Trevor.
Hi, my name is Aris. I work for Oxfam, a development organisation. A lot of the issues you were discussing then touched on the issue of inequality, inequality growing amongst the world in general, income inequality, but also between countries. I'd be interested, from all of your experience, OECD, IMF, World Bank, involvement in a high-level panel there, what do you think the G20 can actually do to address inequality and focus more on the sharing aspect of the G20's mission rather than the growing aspect?
Okay, maybe I'll wait for the next round. So because there are three kind of very important points. One is a follow-up on infrastructure, but focused really on the role of the multilateral development banks, the old ones, the possible new ones, and so on. Then there's the issue of really coordination of monetary policies and the kind of failure of the French attempt initially, but that was then kind of drawn in the Greek crisis, as you said, to focus on the international monetary system, although it's not always clear what people mean by reform of the international monetary system. But maybe David wants to say a few words. And then there's the issue of inequality. I'll say a few words, and maybe Homi can also say a few words. So let's start with Mike. And any of you want to come in on the multilateral development
Just on the multilateral development banks, Danny Roderick made a comment in response to the idea of a BRICS development bank, and he said that what the world needs is not another development bank, what the world needs is leadership. And he's right, we need leadership. And I'm a bit inclined to think before you start creating a new institution, make sure the ones you've got are working. And I think one of the main objectives or main challenges of the G20 is to make sure the multilateral institutions, all of them, and in particular the multilateral development banks, are working. And that's where you really need leadership. They're the institutions that are required, that are meant to deliver the products. You're not meant to, if you're going to keep creating them without making sure you're reforming them. But I think we do need Asian leadership. We certainly need it. That's one of the challenges Australia should be supporting in the G20. In terms of if the Chinese concept of an Asian infrastructure bank, that could be a very positive force. As long as it's directed in the right direction, I think we should be behind supporting it because we need both. We need the supply of finance to the developing countries. We need the leadership to get the multilateral development banks working, but we also need to be able to support, particularly China, taking a leadership role in the world economy.
Well, let me push a little bit further on that, though. And I agree, of course, and you know, I tend to, having worked in the UN system and all that, there are 38 UN organizations, there are many, many development banks in Latin America now, a new one, CAF, is expanding. So it seems almost like, you know, we have a lot of institutions. But on the other hand, the world is changing. The weight of China is obvious. The weight of India is increasing. The weight of Asia is increasing. If these institutions, if the old countries, the advanced countries, refuse to let these institutions change, for example, in terms of the weight of governance at the World Bank, at the IMF, and if they block capital increases, then what else can Asia do but launch its own institutions?
True, but don't give up on the reforming the multilateral development banks. One of the things I think are concerning...
Okay, I'm counting on Australia and pushing hard on that.
Clearly, the G20 is not going to change the attitude of the US Congress when it comes to getting legislation through, for example, the IMF. It's not going to change the attitude about the resistance for any capital increase for the multilateral development banks. But just don't focus on those issues. I think what you've got to do is look at the overall reform, the management structure. It's not just simply a question of quota distribution or shareholders within the World Bank. It's what they do. Get behind the reforms that are meant to be taking place within the World Bank. Get a more efficient organisation. One of the things that struck me so much when we talk about infrastructure and talking to the private sector and even talking to a university saying, okay, look, if you want to get this project going, to finance a developing country, we've got multilateral development banks there, why don't you do them? They said, have you ever tried to deal with the World Bank? It's the most bureaucratic, inefficient organisation. We've put up all the tenders, we keep more tenders, we've got a problem. And that's something more than just the shareholders. It's an important part, and we've got to get on and try and get momentum to get these organisations working.
All right, that's Mike's view. I strongly disagree. I think, you know, every president that's come in at the World Bank for the last 20 years has reformed, has done this and that. There, of course, are many better things that can be done. But more often than not, it's the shareholders, the owners,
which is
that
the G20.
Bring in a lot of the problems. And it's the shareholders who, again, have, you know, endorsed a nominating and procedure of selecting the head of the institutions, which clearly does not reflect the 21st century. So I think there are limits as to what, you know, governments have an easy time, whether it's in Europe or in the world, of blaming the institutions they own for their shortcomings. So I think, anyway.
I'm not blaming the institutions. I'm saying the shareholders just don't focus on a question of changing quota distribution or changing shareholder in the World Bank. The shareholders, being the G20, should be using their representatives and getting behind bigger reforms of these institutions. Example about getting them more efficient in terms of the ability to lend. Well, the concrete example is when you talk to someone wanting to deal with the World Bank, the incredible bureaucratic structures to actually get approval, to get through. And that's why they're walking away from them.
Well, it's an institution that has, you know, the whole world as shareholders. They cannot just make a deal with one private sector firm to get the procurement. Of course, every country insists that there's a competitive, open process which has to be somewhat bureaucratic.
President Kim has said he's trying to reform that process. Shouldn't the shareholders get behind and support him to reform? That's where the G20 can try and get these multilateral institutions working.
Well,
Just
all
don't
right,
bog
we
up and
can't
down
continue
one
forever. Colin, briefly.
Yes. I'd just like to pick up on Andrew's question and broaden it a little bit to what we've been saying. Again, we're using wonk words, right? Infrastructure itself is a wonk word. Recall, we did the same sort of thing that we are doing here with you with the seminar amongst ourselves in a public forum in Korea. And we had a friend of mine who was former Minister of Public Works of Chile come to Korea. And what he said was really interesting in relation to this topic, and I think it bears on the problem of how you mobilize resources for infrastructure. Infrastructure is an abstraction. What you're talking about is water systems for poor people, sewers for poor people who don't have it. You're talking about transportation systems to make the economy more efficient that helps exporters. You're talking about bridges, airports. You're talking about real stuff that influences people's neighborhoods, their businesses, and their long-term growth. And so what Sergio said in Korea was that, he was frustrated by this himself, the same way you are, Mike, is that he was Minister of Public Works and he couldn't get his own parliament. He was a senator before, and everything else is he couldn't mobilize people. So he said, what he learned from that was you have to use different words. You have to make it concrete to people's lives so that people realize that there's some consequence here that you can do something physical and tangible about.
One question. In Australia's aid, which is very valuable, and I think Australia is making a big contribution, but is it untied or is it tied?
Untied.
Okay, it's untied. I wanted to make sure. This is a very good example of what countries can do, because there's a lot of evidence that when you untie your aid, in other words, when you let international competitive processes determine from where developing countries buy their goods or their projects, then when it's untied and when competition takes place, they get it at a much lower price than when it's tied. Right. And unfortunately, a big chunk of Western aid still remains tied rather than untied. Let's move to the other topic of, the monetary policy coordination, the failure of international monetary reform, whatever that particularly means.
Whatever it is. Yeah. Let's come to Yiping's question. I think you put your finger on it in the very last sentence of what you said, that the US is adopting policies which are not of interest to not of value to the rest of the world. And you face that, and you say, now, suppose I try and figure out how to reform the international monetary system, will that help solve that problem? And I think the answer is no. You have to start with the macroeconomic policies and get them right. And we've talked about how moving away from a reliance for many years on very low interest rates and quantitative easing, a move away from that would make a difference to the world. But what does the world do about the international monetary system? That's to say, which currency do you hold your reserves in is the central question in that. That will gradually change. And it will change as the world grows and emerging markets develop over the next 10 years. Just as 100 years ago, sterling was the reserve currency, and Britain ceased to be the centre of the world, and now sterling is a minor currency like many others in Europe and elsewhere. Gradually, people will move away from the US dollar into holding assets in renminbi, not yet, but it's beginning to happen. And in the euro, when Europe sorts itself out, not yet, but maybe it's beginning to happen. This will happen gradually, but don't imagine that by reforming the international monetary system as a starting point, you can somehow end up with the right policies which make the world a well-run place that's more growth-friendly. I think this is a consequence of a well-functioning world rather than a place to start to cause the world to work better.
Thank you. On income distribution, let me say just I think it's a very major issue that's being increasingly addressed politically in the political debate. I think it has very many dimensions. There's the fight against poverty, and I think there has been a lot of progress worldwide against, fighting against extreme poverty. There's the overall distribution, the distribution of salaries. There's the issue of those at the very top and how much they get. But it is a major issue. And I mean, one statistic, which is in a US statistic, we don't have the very good statistics for all the countries. But you know, one amazing statistic following your question is when you look at the income increase that has taken place in the United States as the crisis in 2008 was overcome and the recovery started in 2010, there has been an increase in income of about, you know, close to 8–9%. But 94% of all the increase over the last 5 years in the US has accrued to the top 1% of the population. The median American, or even the average American in the sense of average excluding that 1%, feels nothing of the recovery so far. So I think and you know, this is an extreme case, but there are issues like that all over the world.
Europe.
But let me talk to, let me turn to Homi to say a few words from a global perspective on this very important topic.
Well, I think that one can link some of these themes of, connectivity and integration with the global economy to income distribution. At the end of the day, the people who have been left out of global growth, and I'm not talking now about short-term growth or what's happening in the recovery, but basically the people who've been left out are people who are not well integrated into the global economy. They are marginalized people. They live in remote areas, so they're geographically marginalized. Sometimes they're marginalized by virtue of caste. Sometimes they're marginalized by virtue of gender. Sometimes they're marginalized by virtue of income levels. If you're born into a poor household, you know that your future prospects depend a lot on your parents, their income, their education. So there's a lot that can be done, often with public money, in order to change the opportunities that are available to people. And, you know, as one thinks about the macroeconomic policies of government deficits, I think it's really important not just to think about the deficit, but to think about how that deficit is actually being achieved. What is the composition of spending? How do you make sure that that composition of spending doesn't unfairly penalize people who have the least opportunities? And I might say, doesn't unfairly penalize prospects where you have the highest returns. I think what people sometimes forget is that investing in these kinds of connections actually generates extremely high returns. The highest returns potentially to public spending anywhere in the world are in spending on primary education for people who don't have it, spending on infrastructure access to electricity. 1.5 billion people in the world don't have access to electricity. This is where you get rates of return not of 6% and 7%. This is where you get rates of return of 30% and 40%. And one has to ask the question, why is it that those kinds of returns projects aren't being generated in a world where the cost of capital is, maybe 0, 1%, 2%.
Thank you. So we'll have a last round. We still have another 10 minutes, I think, so very telegraphic, all of us, including ourselves. Yes, sir? Microphone here.
Thank you. My name is Trevor Rowe. I'm chairman of Rothschild in this part of the world. I'm also chairman of a group called UGL Limited that operates in 52 countries around the world in power, energy, water infrastructure related to those areas, resource projects, facilities management and the like. And I start from a purely business perspective about the G20 and the policy issues to get that environment right. So I see from that perspective, the G20 being all about capital flows, trade, and governance, and getting those balances right. And we've talked about infrastructure. I take Colin's point about the definition of infrastructure. But the problem that we see it from a business perspective, here and elsewhere, is there is a disconnect between policymakers, government, and business in terms of achieving outcomes, or the policymakers haven't been able to bring their constituents with them in terms of what they need to do in setting the framework to allow the private sector to invest under such guidelines in infrastructure. And so the challenge from my point of view is you've got this significant, particularly in Western liberal democracies, this disconnect, and to undertake the sort of projects in these key sectors of water, power, energy, resources and the like, it's incredibly bureaucratic, slow and uncertain. There is a large amount of capital sitting out there for infrastructure-related assets. We've been involved selling some utilities out of Australia, and globally we get extraordinary prices with yields as low as 3.5% on major long-term assets. So why are we seeing more greenfield developments? The problem is that we've got governments that just don't understand the position. For example, in Australia, we've got ourselves trapped in this vortex that you've got to be AAA rated, you've got to have a fiscal surplus, irrespective when the economy's turning down, and so consequently we haven't allocated capital or set the policy framework to allocate capital to where we need it, infrastructure and the like, or create a framework where governments are able to borrow long-term, to Mike's point about the ludicrous accounting system where we've had one state in Australia spent a lot of money on infrastructure, had to write it off under their budget, and of course got a mismatch in terms of their debt and their fiscal affairs. So what we need from business is to get governments out of the way, to set the goalposts to enable us to do what we need to do and mobilise capital. And that's part of the problem globally, wherever you go.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes. Thank you very much for raising your hand, because we need some gender balance also around here, including on our panel.
I must confess I had noticed that.
You're right.
So I do actually have a good question to ask, but I thought I'd better do my bit to try and even up the gender balance. So my name's Nancy Waits. I'm from World Vision Australia. And my question is probably mostly directed to Dr. Homi Kharas, because it's about the post-MDGs. As we know, we've had some comments today about the legitimacy of the G20 or otherwise. And with the timing of the post-MDGs and the timing of the Australian G20 Summit in November, there has been a lot of questioning around about what role the G20 could and should play in helping to push to a final agreement, given what we're looking at the moment doesn't seem to bode well for an outcome in time for 2015. I'm also conscious that the UNFCCC faces a similar timeline. So I'd be really interested to hear people's views on what the role of the G20 can or should be in helping to be a bit of a steering committee for some of these very important global concerns. And if it could and should play a role, what would that look like?
Thank you very much. Do we have any one more last point from anybody? No. All right. Well, Homi, why don't you start, and then we'll quickly, each of us have 1 or 2 minutes, not more, because we're really reaching our time slot. Homi.
So I think you've put your finger on something which is really important, which is that there are, aside from the G20 Summit, in 2014 and 2015, there are going to be a number of other global summits. And there'll be a development summit, probably in 2015, and there'll be hopefully a climate agreement in the UNFCCC. In order for those to actually work and deliver on a successful outcome and outcomes with high ambitions, I think that they need to have a common understanding among the major economies of the world. Those major economies of the world are in the G20. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity, actually, for leaders in the G20 to start to talk about the contours of those other major summits, to discuss amongst themselves, not to come to any agreement, but to discuss amongst themselves how can they try to make sure that you have an ambitious, successful outcome. Because at the end of the day, they will be asked to sign on to those other agreements, and it's much easier to form a critical mass, if you like, of some understanding of the issues, of the complexities, of where they differ in a small group like the G20, rather than in negotiating with the 193 member states of the United Nations that are trying to craft these agreements. So I think the G20 should look upon itself as being a group that brings forward some ideas from a critical mass of the world, but also emphasizes the importance of ambitious outcomes of these really important international issues. And just one thing I think that has been so impressive is that the level of public interest in these other summits in G20 countries is absolutely enormous. In the context of the high-level panel work, there was an extraordinary amount of interest from civil society, from business, from others in that work. And I think that's something that G20 leaders need to speak to. They need to speak to the concerns of their citizens. And those concerns are very much about not just what is the G20 doing, but what is the world doing to try to solve these big problems of our time.
Thank you, Homi. David, last word.
Mike talked about the need for leadership. It's central. Why haven't we got a global compact in pushing towards more growth-friendly policies and a more rapidly growing world? It's partly a function of understanding. As he said, in a world where the private sector is deleveraging, banks and consumers still spending less, there's a need for finding a way of increasing spending that gets round that difficulty, and also that gets round the difficulty of those countries that have high debt problems and perceive the need not to be able to push any further. And finding that way through is the central part of, I think, the task in the next year. And leadership on that question in finding some growth-friendly outcomes is central. And we've talked about investment in infrastructure and in other projects that give assets for the future and enable production and growth to rise. And that's what we should be working for on the macroeconomic part of the G20 agenda.
Colin, quickly, last word.
Sure. Leadership really is about politics, and if I may say something about your politics, it is interesting. You're in a good moment. You're taking over the G20 when you've just had an election and you've just elected your leader at 54% of the vote. So he has a mandate. And
that's as opposed to some other countries who timed the G20 just before their elections.
Yes, right. Moving right along.
Or Mexico.
So he has a mandate, and he's moved the political point in the spectrum towards the political center, which is helpful in all of our countries. So the question I guess I would have for Prime Minister Abbott and his party is, think about over this next year and the coming months as he takes over the presidency, think about what elements out of the conservative thought stream you can pull into this global conversation that would be useful in terms of moving these agendas forward, but also would connect with the thought stream coming from elsewhere. And so I think that is to the left of center, because we have systemic diversity in the G20, not only in terms of cultures, but also in terms of politics. And I think that's the way to think about how to have resolution of these issues, is to importantly use the politics of leaders in this forum to pull issues back into the center of the political spectrum where things can be pragmatically resolved rather than posturing on the extremes and taking positions which are pure, but in the end don't lead to any pragmatic, practical action.
Thank you. Mike.
Just on the role Australia can play, something you raised, Gamal. Let's face it, Australia is so pleased to be at this head table, the steering committee, the global steering committee. But someone made a very good comment which said, don't take our presence at the table for granted and don't take the table for granted. Because if it's not effective, the game's going to move elsewhere. And if it moves elsewhere, as Colin says, there has to be a global steering body somewhere. And if it moves away from the G20, it's likely to be a smaller body and Australia won't be there. So it's a very self-interest that we should try and make this G20 work. The Minister talked about bringing some attributes of the Australian character. I think that's right. We try hard because we want to be accepted. We throw ourselves into international forums, which we will with this one. We are pragmatic, we are can-do. We can be blunt, and let's face it, you've got to be blunt to get these international organisations, and that's a characteristic that a chair should have. The other one is exactly the one you pointed and what the Minister referred to about our unique position. We're a Western country in Asia, physically in Asia, economically in Asia, but we have good relationships. We have to be trying to lift the voice of Asia, commensurate with its weight in the global economy. Korea made a mark in terms of being an emerging market. It's the first emerging market to chair it. One of our aims should be to try and move the G20, which is still a very European, North American dominated forum, and the bodies around it, particularly the FSB, we have to be working incredibly hard to be trying to look to the future, and the future is going to be Asia, and make sure that Asia, you talk about these multilateral organisations, we talk about the FSB, everything like that, they have to be part of it, accept it, own it, because that's where the action is going to be in the future.
Thank you. And as a Turk, I can say we're in the same boat, I think, in terms of categories. Good. You know, the Australia's, Korea's, Turkey's,
I thought you were in Europe.
Well, we're everywhere. But let me end by really recalling one other, perhaps a little bit sad thing, but I want to end on an uplifting note. But 2014 will also be the anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. And lately, histories have been written, rewritten, and when we kind of read these histories, none of us, I guess, was alive at that time, but the world went to war without even noticing. It wasn't, the Second World War was different. There was a clear aggressor and all that. First World War, kind of just happened. Nobody really wanted it. And it happened, and 37 million is the estimate. People got killed in the war. And, huge destruction was created all over the world. And then the post-war period was mismanaged terribly. Those who won the war did not realize that imposing huge penalties on those who lost would be counterproductive. And then came the Great Depression with unemployment rates, of 25–30% in major countries, including very much Germany, of course. And by the way, in Spain and Greece now it is 25%.
Yeah.
And then came the catastrophe of the Second World War, which probably wouldn't have happened if the First World War hadn't happened in the first place. And then, of course, after these catastrophes, humanity did launch an effort at cooperation, not perfect, but many of the institutions were created. The United Nations, of course. There was the Cold War. There were many problems. But overall, it was managed better than the aftermath of the First World War. And part of that was due to international cooperation. And I want to kind of particularly say to my friend Mike, part of it was also due to the international institutions. They provided a framework of working together, of cooperating, and a certain spirit of internationalism that I think is very important. There are two aspects to international cooperation. One is the cooperation between nation states, which are the fundamental building blocks of the international system, but one also has to look beyond the nation state to multinational forms of governance, and we will get to that, I guess, in a second, and look beyond one's borders. So Australia is taking on the leadership of the G20 on the year of the anniversary of the First World War, which should be a warning and also a message that international cooperation is just hugely important. I was very frustrated. I was at the World Bank. I was director for Eastern Europe. We had many projects in Yugoslavia. We had built roads, hospitals, factories, and then, somehow governance failed, and Yugoslavia was a microcosm of war and sank into destruction. It was hard, and we economists, unfortunately, are powerless when this happens, although we do have some influence, I think, trying to prevent by having full employment, by having economies that thrive, and by having less inequality and things like that. So I think the stakes are really huge. And I must say, I am very happy that Australia, a country like Australia, which does have straight talk, which doesn't beat around the bush, which has links to so many parts of the world, and which isn't itself it's an important power, but not a superpower. It doesn't try to impose its will on others, is leading this process at a historically very important moment, both in terms of grand history that I just mentioned, but also the point we're at in the world economy. We have the resources. There are huge sums of money. There are huge masses of profits in the corporate sector. There are huge savings available, particularly in Asia. There is technology. I'm sure everything that we're talking about here is being, tweeted, and not only tweeted, but also taped for various intelligence services. Not that anything we said was, I wish them happiness reading it. But, we have the technology, we have the resources. The binding constraint really is good governance and cooperation, and I wish Australia all the best, and I trust that it will be a very successful chair of the G20. Thank you.
Right. Well done, Kamal.